Welcome, everyone. I'd love to introduce you to my guest, but also why we're here today. 4 chapter leaders from 3 chapters of the American Marketing Association, AMA Cincinnati, AMA PDX, and AMA New York, came together to explore an important question. What is marketing's role in creating an inclusive future? The answers came from 25 CMOs that were part of a confidential focus group. Their thoughts and ideas are summarized in a 42-page report and bolstered by a series of discussions we are having with chief diversity officers on their roles and how the offices of the CDO and the CMO can partner in advancing the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to my guest today, Tamika Curry-Smith. Tamika is the Chief Diversity Officer at ARM, a semiconductor and software design company. She also serves as president of the TCS Group, a firm that provides human resources and DEI solutions to a broad range of clients. She was previously vice president of global diversity and inclusion at Nike, where she was responsible for leading a global D&I team across the Nike, Jordan, and Converse brands, as well as head of diversity and inclusion at Mercedes-Benz, director of diversity at Target Corporation, and director of diversity programs for Deloitte Consulting. So Tamika, thank you again for joining today. I really appreciate you being here. I just read a small part of your resume, right? But as you already know, but the audience might not know, there's so much there: awards, speaker, just a whole lot of accolades that I wish we had time to mention. But suffice it to say, your journey has been eventful right over the past 20 years. And I'd love for you to tell me a little bit about it, and also how you ended up in this current role today.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to spend this time with you and everyone in the organization. And my story is, to your point, very eventful. I could not have planned it, and I did not plan it. Well, I did plan it, but it didn't turn out the way that I planned. But yeah, happy to share my journey. Believe it or not, I started my career at Deloitte doing auditing and accounting. My undergraduate degree is in accounting. I grew up in the Detroit area, went to the University of Michigan undergrad, go blue, and majored in accounting, and went to Deloitte as my first job after graduation. And I was with Deloitte for a total of 10 years, roughly, and did auditing, accounting, and management consulting for 8 of those years. Also went back during that time and got my MBA at Kellogg, the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. But how I got into DEI work was completely by chance. I literally got a call out of the blue one day from the head of HR at Deloitte asking me if I wanted to lead back then it was just diversity for North and South America. This was 20 years ago. And I thought, what? Like, I have no HR background. I wasn't even doing human capital consulting. I had been doing strategy and operations consulting, everything from mergers and acquisitions to supply chain and logistics, and a variety of more operations focused consulting work. So at the time, I didn't quite understand it, but I say that people sometimes see things in you you don't see yourself. I had always been the one, this is mid 90s, and there weren't a lot of women or people of color in accounting or management consulting. And so I had always been the one advocating to go back and to be a part of the recruiting team, that we were going to different colleges and universities, or expand the schools we were going to, to be on the interview slate when people, we were conducting interviews, or to be, a buddy or a mentor when people join the firm. And so I was always advocating for these things, not recognizing that I was kind of doing the work on the side anyway. And so I think I developed this reputation for really caring about these issues and advocating for people. And so it ended up being a very natural choice for them to reach out to me. But, I still wasn't quite sold. And so I negotiated a backdoor. If I didn't like it, could I go back into client service? And they said, absolutely. But I've been doing this work ever since, and that was 20 years ago. So I did that at Deloitte for 2 years. I left and went to Target. I was their first diversity leader. and built the strategy, the team, and the budget from scratch. For me, it was the most career transformative experience because I got to do that at an amazing brand with great scale and scope at that time, 300,000 team members, 1,200 stores, 15 distribution centers.
Wow.
So that was an amazing experience. Then life took over a little bit. I got married, I had my son, I became an entrepreneur, and that's actually when I first started my HR and DEI consulting firm. And then since that time, I've kind of gone in and out of corporate America, depending on what worked for me at the time. So, I subsequently went and led DEI at Mercedes-Benz USA, and then most recently at Nike Inc. before I joined ARM earlier this year. And my path to ARM was an interesting one. It's as you mentioned, in the technology industry, which I've never worked in. But I kind of made an intentional decision when I left Nike to focus on earlier stage and smaller companies because I feel like there's an opportunity to really build DEI into the fabric of how organizations work. We say that all the time in this space, but it's I do this work to have an impact and make a difference, and there's more opportunity to have impact in earlier stage companies and smaller companies where you can really embed this work. And then as they scale and they grow and as they mature, it truly is more organic and the way that they operate. And so that was really how I ended up at ARM in a new industry and really helping to advance the discussion and the work in an industry that has tremendous opportunity to do better when it comes to DEI.
Well, that is so true. And I actually really love your background because when you talk about, embedding it into all aspects of the organization, the fact that you have all this expertise in the operational structure, the supply side, like all of these other areas, which maybe people don't traditionally think of as being opportunities for, true inclusion work, right? But you've been thinking about this for a very long time and implementing it for a very long time. So I think that's a huge advantage when you think about this work, like outside of the HR realm, right?
It's actually one of the things I love the most about these roles, or at least the roles that I've taken on, is I've been very clear that the scope of DEI is much broader than just HR. Certainly it has HR components to it and definitely should. But I always like to frame up the work in terms of workforce, the people, marketplace, or workplace, the culture, and then marketplace, which is all of the business initiatives, how you're operating in the community, more the externally facing things. This work really encompasses all those things. And so I love it because you get a bird's eye view of every company and you get the chance to integrate DEI into all the different facets and functions that make an organization operate. And having a business background and using that background to really have a business-centered approach to this work has been really critical for me.
What have you seen? You've been in the B2C side, now the B2B side. What have you seen to be significant differences or challenges between those two areas?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that at the core, the topics and the things that you're focusing on are very similar along those pillars of workforce, workplace, marketplace. But how you bring them to life is very different. In B2C organizations, you have a bit of a really obvious business case, so to speak, right? Because you can link what you're trying to do to consumer facing, to if you have products and services that you're delivering, you can talk about, how do you expand the pie for those? How do you go to new markets and things of that sort? So with the consumer facing side, you have both an internally driven compelling why, and then you also have an externally consumer driven compelling why. So I would say that makes it somewhat easier to get people to galvanize around the importance of this topic. A little bit harder in B2B because people don't always see that direct connection to the customer or the consumer. But what you have to do is make that connection for them. And so it requires a little more work because ultimately, who is the end user is what you're framing this work on. And so although as a company, you may not be directly selling to consumers, somebody is. And so how do you make the case for connecting the business of what that organization is doing with the ultimate end goal and having a more inclusive, not just company, but world that we live in? So I would say similar, but different, probably a little more challenging on the B2B side because the connection is not as obvious.
Right. And I think at least what I found, and you can totally correct me, your history is much more well versed in this, but I found that most people want to start with, recruitment and the talent pipeline. And they're not really paying attention to all these different aspects that you're covering, right? They're just like, well, if we just find more people, we can essentially check the box and we can, sign up for some community programs and, celebrate the cultural holidays and just do some of these are important things, but, ingraining D&I into your systems and your processes, especially on the B2B side, like you said, it's really hard to make those connections. Do you have any advice for senior leadership in terms of making that connection or how they need to start thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you, and anyone who knows me or probably has heard me speak knows that I feel pretty strongly about this. I would say one of the first pieces of advice is not to have DEI in the HR organization. Quite frankly, I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that organizations make is having DEI report up through HR. And when you do that, you immediately send a signal that this is just about that. And so then that individual, that chief diversity officer, head of, whatever the official title is, has to then kind of elbow their way into more business facing conversations or more customer facing or, product growth or marketing segmentation or to your point, even some of the external and community work. You're almost fighting for a seat at the table because the work has been pigeonholed in a way that says it's just about HR. And so, I always say, if you think about the value of this work, we know that diverse teams are higher performing. We know that companies that focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion have better people outcomes, meaning more productivity, more employee engagement, less turnover, et cetera. We know that organizations that focus on DEI also have better business outcomes, and that is in terms of market share, customer satisfaction, revenue, profitability, shareholder price, et cetera. Like I could go on and on about all of the business reasons why DEI makes sense. So if that is true, put this work where it belongs, and that is reporting to an operational leader. My preference would always be the CEO because then you immediately communicate the importance of the work. But a COO, a president, someone that really is driving the core of the business, and then make sure that person has a very tight connection to HR, but is not necessarily reporting up through it, I think is great. I feel like I'm in the best situation right now in my current role at ARM. I report to the CEO. I have a dotted line to the CHRO or Chief People Officer. And then I sit on her people leadership team. So I'm in every meeting as talent acquisition and talent management and learning and development and comp and benefits. As we're discussing all the things that make sense for people, I'm there, but I'm also having broader conversations with the business teams also about emerging markets. And I'm talking with the marketing teams about branding and our external messaging. I'm talking with the sustainability team about ESG and how DEI and sustainability need to be connected. So it just by the virtue of where the role sits, I am automatically invited in and considered, to have a much broader scope. So that would be my biggest piece of advice. Start where you want it to end.
Oh, you know what? That is amazing. That is truly that you're sitting in all these conversations and adding that lens and that voice. So you brought up marketing, and that's a little bit why we're here too, right? So can you talk a little bit about how you work with the marketing team, and are there any specific challenges that you've seen them face, or any tips or advice in terms of how they can get? I'm asking a bunch of questions, so let me back it up. Let me just talk a little bit about how you work with the marketing team, and then I'll ask my second question after that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the the way that CDOs should work with marketing varies, once again, based on that B2C or B2B context. And B2B companies that I've worked with, the connection, I'll be honest, was probably much tighter and much stronger, because so much of the work that you're doing is consumer facing and is trying to drive market growth and sales, right? So if I think about, for example, at Mercedes, I was working with the marketing teams really frequently to look at everything from casting in our advertisements to marketing and advertising placements to looking at customer statistics and looking at different market segments and how do we grow that. And so if we wanted to do that, are there different places that we need to go and to share the messages about the products and services that we had to offer? There was a whole thread around external branding. So what we sponsor, and when we're there, how are we showing up? So a partnership that really transcended both internally and externally. There was, for example, at Target, there was also a thread with working with the marketing teams internally around everything from a logo for our DEI initiatives to logos for the employee resource groups to a marketing campaign that we ended up running internally that profiled employees. So typically you want to have a partnership that is both internal and external. And you want to really say, how can marketing enable the broader business strategy in the same way that DEI enables the broader business strategy? So how do you create a partnership where both of those messages are in tandem and ultimately are advancing the business goals? That's really why we're all here. And in terms of, particular challenges, I would say some of the biggest ones are, how do you get the marketing team to understand the DEI voice that you need to have in a way that's authentic? Because I think the best way that you can bring DEI initiatives to life in any organization is for the messages to be very organic and very authentic. And that honestly often takes practice, and it takes knowledge building. It takes a little bit of osmosis and sharing, where marketing has to kind of understand what it is that the DEI team is doing, understand the partnerships, so that they can help land the messaging and the marketing in a way where it will resonate. So it truly is like, how do you take both areas of expertise, because they are that. DEI brings a certain level of expertise and marketing brings a certain level of expertise. And honestly, the true embodiment of diversity is, though they both have a really critical role to play, how do you bring them together and make 1 + 1 be 3 and not 2? Because you'll be stronger together because you're amplifying the message in a really organic way. But it usually takes time to get there. So it doesn't happen overnight. And it requires ongoing time spent together, quite frankly, to land it.
Yeah, I would love, like, let me just focus in on one area, just as a specific example around messaging, for instance, which is really the core of a lot of marketing. So, like, how specifically does that on a day-to-day basis occur, right? Do you come into the marketing team meetings or talking about, I don't know, launching a product or something? Like, can you give me an example of like how that would actually work in terms of that engagement?
Yeah, I mean, I'll use Target as an example. So when I was at Target, obviously they're very consumer facing, lots of products and services. And so I had regular meetings with both the marketing and merchandising teams. And so I'll give you an example. So one topic was around ethnic hair care.
Mhm.
And at that time, this is back in 2005, perhaps, there was this discussion around, do we inline ethnic hair care, or do we have a separate section? So I would work with the marketing and merchandising teams and say, okay, do we need to do some focus groups and see, like, let's test both and get feedback and see how that works. We actually did focus groups internally with employees, where we brought in members of the different employee resource groups and said, which would work better for you and why, and got feedback from them. The marketing team may then start to think about, okay, how do we, if we're going to do, let's say we decide to inline it. Okay, how are we going to call it out? So is that particular signage? Is it highlighting Black-owned products? And what does that look like? And thinking through that. And then they may go and do some focus groups and come back with some tests on different ads. I may look at those ads. I may once again pull in the employee resource groups and say, hey, what do we think or feel about this? And crowdsource ideas from them. So it's actually it can get pretty tactical and tangible. And so it all starts with building the relationship so that there is that natural connection, and where they're, as I said before, inviting you in to say, this trifecta, in that case, it's marketing, merchandising, and DEI. This trifecta is actually going to help us land this better in our store so that we can drive more sales ultimately for the business. So that's an example. Hopefully that helps illustrate.
No, it does. I love that. Actually reminded me of, I know you earlier said B2B is more of a challenge, which I agree, B2B is my background. But one of the examples from the focus group was that and you also brought up ERGs, one of the ERGs helped out with this idea, in that they realized that they didn't have enough customers of color, right? Black and Latina. And so they asked the ERGs to help them create a list, right, of who they would want as customers, and then gave those lists to the sales team to increase that, right? So it was just that small, very tangible partnership that was meaningful in terms of growing the business, obviously, right? But also lending itself to the DEI goals that they had for the organization. So, it really does take that collaboration and being creative and inventive in those ways, along with some of the tried and true efforts of just getting feedback, right? From a variety of constituents to understand if what you're doing is authentic and real for the organization.
Absolutely. And you want that representation that's providing the input and the feedback, because I think we've seen, unfortunately, organizations get in trouble sometimes when they don't have diverse voices around the table and chiming in about what works and what doesn't work. And so it's so important to, if you're not invited, find a way to insert yourself into some of those conversations, because here's what I found is that if you're not included on the front end, you sure will be included on the back end if something goes wrong, because then they'll be coming to you to try to fix it. So what I always say is, let's be proactive about it, and let's prevent the issues from occurring rather than pulling DE in on the back end to try to be the doctor that fixes problems.
Last question for you. Mm-hmm. For organizations that may not be where ARM is, or some of the other organizations, or they may sit in HR right now for some reason, what can the head of diversity and or the head of marketing do? Should they have secret meetings or just lead by example? Are there things that they could get started today, even if the organization isn't structured to have D&I, integrated throughout the entire organization?
Absolutely. I mean, here's the reality. I'm advocating for something that is not the norm. Let me be clear. So 2/3 of CDO roles do report into HR. So that actually is the majority of cases. And so, although I wish it were different, and it's definitely trending, I would say, to reporting in a more operational way, there's still a lot you can do. Take me, I'm a perfect example. Prior to ARM, all of my roles reported to HR, but I still was doing all the things that I just discussed, right? And so I think you can do a couple of things. One is that make sure that you have an audience with business leaders. So even if you don't report to them, I had in previous roles a regular status with the CEO, regular status with the COO. You definitely want to, have those connections with leaders. A great way to do that is to create a DEI steering committee or council. They go by different names, but this is typically senior leaders across all the functions, the top functions in the organization. Even if you report to HR, if you can convene that group and make it so that you want to make sure that the time is well spent, but that there's a two-way exchange where you're sharing your goals and your initiatives and what you're trying to do, but you're also saying, like, what do you need from us and how can we partner together? Because then that gives you visibility with all of those leaders and a connection to then have further conversations as you move forward, or to go to them and say, hey, I really have an idea for our teams to work together. So if you go to the CMO and say, I think there's a great way that we can be partners and collaborate more. Or similarly, when you go to the head of operations and say, I really like to get in front of your sales teams or whatever it is, and help advance that. So I think finding those connections and ways to talk to the leaders and elevate the issues so that they don't just stand within HR. And in marketing specifically, what I think really works well is, sure, have an initial meeting that's just brainstorming with, doesn't even have to be the CMO, but maybe you're the DEI team and some people from the marketing team, and just say, like, where can we collaborate? Come up with a couple of ideas, put together a proposal, and talk about what you want to do. Maybe even try to get approval to pilot a couple of things, because what I've also found is that when you show success and you show growth, it's hard for people to say no. So oftentimes a way to open the door is to show value, and sometimes that happens from piloting something, getting people to see the compelling impact that you can have, and then that opens up the door for more things to happen. So organically do it, pick a couple of things, and then iterate from there. I always say progress over perfection. So you may not get the whole ball of wax the first time, but how do you even get the process started and moving in that direction?
I agree. And, my position is that marketers have a responsibility to do this. So why not seek out and curate the help to do it right? And, add value to the organization through the brand by seeking professional help of the CDO. Tamika, I can talk to you about this for like so much longer. All right. You brought up so many good points. I have so many questions, but we might have to save it for another time.
Of course.
I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights and being here today. This audience will learn so much from you, and they have actually some action steps that they can take, which is also really helpful. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been great chatting with you, and I hope everything I shared was helpful.
Definitely was. And
All right.
we'll have you back again to do part 2.